Welcome, listeners, to True Wild West, where we unearth forgotten tales of grit, resilience, and unexpected love from the untamed frontier. Imagine a young woman, heartbroken and alone, forced into a marriage she never wanted, her wedding day tears echoing the vast, desolate Montana landscape. But what if a quiet whisper from a stranger, her new husband, planted a seed of hope that would one day bloom into the most profound love? This isn't just a story. It's a journey into the heart of the Wild West, a testament to the power of human connection in the face of hardship. Don't go anywhere. This is one you won't want to miss. Montana Territory, 1878. The wind, a relentless force, howled off the crazy mountains, as if determined to prove its dominion. It kicked up dust devils that danced across the barren landscape and rattled the very windows of the small, unassuming chapel. Inside, standing before the preacher, Elara Zeller fought a losing battle against her own despair. Tears, hot and uncontrollable, streamed down her cheeks, leaving glistening tracks on her pale skin. She held her breath, trying desperately to stifle the ragged sobs that tore from her throat. But they came anyway, sharp, raw, like something vital breaking deep within her soul. She was marrying a complete stranger, a man she barely knew, a man she certainly didn't love. He stood beside her, a towering figure, his presence as unyielding as the mountains outside. His skin was tanned and weathered from countless hours under the relentless sun, and he clutched a dark brown hat in his calloused, capable hands. His name was Nolan Nash, a cattleman whose ranch lay on the remote southern fringes of the vast Bitterroot Valley. They had exchanged words only twice before this fateful day. The first time was when her brother, a man driven by desperation and debt, had arranged this marriage of convenience. The second was when Elara, summoning every ounce of courage she possessed, had begged him not to go through with it. On that occasion, Nolan had said nothing. He simply looked at her with those deep-set, watchful eyes that seemed to hold the quiet wisdom of the prairie. He nodded once, a gesture that spoke volumes, as if he understood a silent plea she hadn't dared to voice. Now, as the preacher's droning words filled the small chapel, Nolan's voice reached her, a low, intimate whisper meant only for her ears. His shoulder brushed hers, a fleeting, almost imperceptible touch. "I'll make you smile someday." Those simple words, spoken with such quiet conviction, struck Elara like a sudden, unexpected warmth in the biting cold. They were a lifeline in a sea of despair. Her red-rimmed eyes, swollen from crying, lifted to meet his. Disbelief warred with a fragile flicker of hope within her. He wasn't handsome in the refined, polished way of the city gentleman she had only ever heard about. No, Nolan was a man forged by the land, all angles and sun-kissed roughness, with lines etched around his eyes that hinted at harsh winters, endless toil, and the weight of difficult, solitary choices. Yet his eyes, those steady, unwavering eyes, held a surprising kindness. She managed a ragged breath, her gaze still locked with his. The preacher's monotone continued, weaving words of union and commitment that felt hollow to Elara. Her brother, Obadiah, stood stiffly to the side, his arms crossed, jaw set in a grim line. He had amassed crippling debts. Nolan, on the other hand, possessed land, cattle, and a quiet, formidable strength. This was not a love match, not in any romantic sense. It was a transaction, a matter of survival for Elara's family, and by extension for her. Elara had no say in her own destiny, no voice in this arrangement. But Nolan had not touched her, had not made any demands. He simply stood there, as still and solid as a mountain, and whispered a promise that resonated deep within her troubled heart. They rode away in silence, the small wagon rattling over the uneven terrain. Elara was wrapped tightly in a thick wool shawl, its coarse fibers a meager comfort against the biting wind. Nolan guided the team with one hand, the reins held loose and easy, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The wedding ring, a simple band of silver, felt impossibly heavy on her finger. She stared at it, a symbol of her new, uncertain life. Then, at the vast, sprawling land, stretching endlessly in every direction, a land as uncertain and unpredictable as her own future. "You hungry?" he asked after a long while, his voice gentle. She shook her head, unable to speak. He nodded once, acknowledging her silence, and said no more. By sundown, they reached his homestead. It was a modest cabin, tucked neatly beneath the rise of a barren hill, with a lean-to for the horses and a comforting curl of smoke still rising from the chimney. As they approached, a woman stepped outside. She was older, with a sturdy build, streaks of gray in her hair, and a rifle slung casually across her shoulder, a common sight in these parts. "This her?" she asked, her voice raspy, but not unkind. Nolan climbed down from the wagon, then helped Elara descend. "Elara, this is May. She helped raise me after my folks passed." May looked Elara over, her gaze direct and assessing, but without judgment. "We got stew. Come inside." The cabin's interior smelled of pine, rabbit stew, and the comforting scent of a crackling wood fire. Elara sat stiffly in a corner chair, feeling utterly out of place, while Nolan hung up his coat. May, with practiced ease, began ladling generous portions of stew into thick ceramic bowls. "Eat," May commanded, placing a bowl in front of Elara. "You look like the wind could carry you off." Elara ate, finding a small measure of solace in the simple act. It gave her something to do, a way to avoid the quiet intensity of the moment. Nolan remained silent, eating slowly, his watchful eyes occasionally drifting toward her, subtly, without making it obvious. When Elara eventually stood to take her empty bowl to the basin, her hands trembled visibly. May reached out, her strong, work-worn hand steadying Elara's. "You did not choose this," May said quietly, her voice softening. "But Nolan's a good man. He will not hurt you." Elara merely nodded, her throat tight with unshed tears. That night, Nolan lit a single lamp in the front room, casting a warm glow across the rough-hewn walls. He gestured toward the bed. "I'll sleep out here," he stated simply. Elara nodded again, a wave of gratitude washing over her, mixed with a profound sense of shame for her unwilling heart. He paused at the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim light, then added, "You're safe here." The words, earnest and unwavering, were a balm to her frayed nerves. The days that followed blurred into a slow, quiet rhythm. Elara swept the cabin, fetched water from the well, and mended linens, her hands growing accustomed to the simple, repetitive tasks. Nolan worked tirelessly with the cattle, repaired fences that had succumbed to the harsh winter, and rode out into the early morning light, returning each evening with dust clinging to his hair and clothes. He never touched her, never asked about the quiet sobs she couldn't always suppress at night, believing he was asleep. But he noticed. He started leaving small, thoughtful tokens on the table. A jar of freshly picked wildflowers, a tin of sweet tobacco for May, a folded note that read, "Wagon needs fixing, but I will take you into town soon." Elara never replied, but something within her, a hardened shell of sorrow, began to soften, piece by agonizing piece. Then, one morning, May gently shook Elara awake. "Come quick," she urged, her voice hushed. Outside by the fence line, Nolan was kneeling beside a small girl, a tiny thing, perhaps 6 or 7, with tangled, matted hair and shoes that were little more than rags. Behind her stood a boy, older by a few years, his arms wrapped protectively around his sister's shoulders. "Found them by the creek," Nolan explained, his voice grave. "No adults." Elara knelt beside the trembling child. "What are your names?" she asked gently. "Clara," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. "And that's my brother, Caleb." May and Elara immediately set about caring for them. They washed the grime from their skin, fed them warm, nourishing food, and soothed their shaking bodies and fearful hearts. Later, as the sun dipped low, painting the western sky in hues of orange and purple, the children sat curled beneath a quilt by the fire, finally safe. Elara stood on the porch, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her gaze fixed on the darkening hills. "Where are their parents?" she asked, the question heavy in the quiet air. Nolan stared out into the vast, fading light. "Found a wagon turned over downstream," he replied, his voice low. "Empty. No tracks but theirs." "They were abandoned?" Elara whispered, the words catching in her throat. "Looks like it," Nolan confirmed, his face etched with sorrow. Elara's hands clenched into tight fists. She remembered the gnawing ache of being left behind after her mother died, after her father drank himself into ruin, after her brother bartered her name for a stack of cattle receipts. She turned to Nolan, her voice firm. "They can stay, right?" He looked at her then, truly looked, and a slow, steady nod was his only reply. Of course. Weeks melted into months. Elara, with a tenderness she hadn't known she possessed, began brushing Clara's tangled hair each morning, humming old lullabies her mother used to sing. Caleb, shy but eager, followed Nolan around like a shadow, a silent apprentice. He helped with chores, learned to mend a saddle, and eagerly absorbed every lesson about checking the fence line. Elara even caught Nolan smiling once, just a flicker, a fleeting softening of his usually stoic expression when Caleb, after countless tries, managed to toss a rope just right. One evening, after supper, Clara, without a word or an invitation, simply crawled into Elara's lap. Elara froze for a moment, then, as if by instinct, wrapped her arms tightly around the small, trusting body. "You smell like cinnamon," Clara mumbled, already half asleep. Elara looked up, her gaze meeting Nolan's across the hearth. His eyes held something quiet and full, a deep contentment she hadn't seen before. He didn't look away, and neither did she. The first snow of winter fell soft and slow, blanketing the homestead in a pristine white. Elara stood at the window, watching the delicate flakes drift down like feathers. Nolan came up behind her, not too close, but closer than usual. "You still sad?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. She nodded, her gaze still fixed on the winter wonderland outside. "Sometimes." He hesitated then. "I meant what I said. I will make you smile someday." She turned to face him, a new light in her eyes. "You already did." And just like that, the invisible barrier between them shifted, dissolving into something warmer, more tangible. He reached out slowly, his calloused fingers gently touching her hand. There was no rush, no demand, just a touch, warm, steady, comforting. Elara did not pull away, not this time. The ice came early that year, a relentless, creeping cold that crawled over the edges of the creek, seeming to stake its claim for the entire season. Elara wrapped Clara in an extra shawl before they headed out to the henhouse, the child's small hand tucked securely in hers. The morning air was still, save for the occasional wooden groan of the trees as they settled under the heavy frost. Elara moved carefully, mindful of the slick earth, her breath rising in soft white clouds. Inside the henhouse, the chickens stirred lazily as she gathered eggs into a basket Caleb had painstakingly carved with Nolan's help. Clara, her tongue held in concentration between her teeth, counted each egg under her breath, her numbers clear and steady. Elara watched her for a moment, then reached out and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from the girl's cheek. "You're steadier than most grown folk," she said with a soft smile. Clara didn't reply, but her smile was gentle, and when they stepped back outside, she didn't let go of Elara's hand until they reached the safety of the porch. Inside, the fire crackled a low, comforting tune. May was seated at the table, a length of coarse wool stretched across her lap, a needle glinting in her nimble fingers. Elara noticed Nolan's coat draped over a nearby chair, the tear at its shoulder newly stitched with May's expert hand. "You've got a good hand with mending," Elara observed, setting the basket of eggs down on the counter. May didn't look up from her work. "Keeps me from thinking too much. Not all thoughts are worth the space they take." Elara nodded, understanding the unspoken sentiment, and poured water into the kettle. By the time the sun had climbed past the eastern ridge, casting long shadows, Nolan returned with a brace of hares slung over his saddle. His horse's breath steamed visibly in the bitter cold as he dismounted. Elara opened the door for him, a silent welcome. He stamped the accumulated snow from his boots and carried the hares to the back room without needing to be told where to put them, a natural part of the household now. Later, as the children played quietly with their carved animal toys by the warmth of the fire, Elara stood at the window, her arms folded, watching the sky deepen into dusk. Nolan joined her after hanging his coat. She didn't turn toward him, but she didn't move away either. "There's a traveling doctor headed up from Bozeman," he said, his voice quiet. "May heard from a trapper. Should be here in a few weeks." "Is someone sick?" she asked, a flicker of concern in her voice. "No," he replied, "but it wouldn't hurt to have a look at Clara's cough." "And Caleb's arm still stiffens when the cold hits." She nodded, her gaze still fixed on the horizon, a thoughtful expression on her face. "You think they'll stay when spring comes?" He was quiet for a moment, considering. Then, "I hope they will, but I won't hold them if they don't want to." She turned to him then, searching his face, a deep question in her eyes. "You'd let them go if it meant they'd be happier elsewhere?" Elara looked down at her hands, turning the wedding ring thoughtfully. "That kind of letting go, it's not weakness, is it?" "No," he said, his voice firm and steady. "It's the hardest kind of strength." That night, after the children were settled into their slumber, and May had retired to her room, Elara lingered by the hearth. Nolan sat across from her, a book open in his lap, though she noticed he hadn't turned a page in some time. "I used to sing," she said, her voice barely a whisper, as if sharing a secret. "Back when my mother was alive, she'd hum while she worked, and I'd follow her tune." He looked up from his book, his eyes gentle. "Why'd you stop?" "I didn't have the heart for it after she passed," Elara confessed. She hesitated, then added, "I don't remember the sound of her voice anymore, just the shape of it, like a room I used to know." He closed the book, placing it carefully beside him. "You could sing again. No one would stop you here." Elara didn't answer. The fire popped softly, a small, comforting sound in the quiet room. Then she hummed, so faintly it was more breath than tune, a fragile wisp of melody. Nolan didn't move, didn't speak. He simply listened, a silent invitation. If you're enjoying this journey into the past, remember to subscribe to True Wild West and hit the notification bell so you never miss another captivating story. The next day brought a wind strong enough to rattle the very shutters of the cabin. Caleb stayed close to Nolan, helping him sort through the dry goods they'd brought from town the week before. Ilara and May worked diligently over a pot of stew, its rich aroma filling the kitchen, while Clara sat at the table with a strip of cloth and a darning needle, her tongue held between her teeth in intense concentration. May glanced toward the window, her seasoned eyes assessing the sky. "Storm's rolling in," she predicted. Ilara nodded, unfazed. "We'll ride it out." That night, snow piled high against the door, insulating the cabin from the fierce winds. Nolan checked the roof beams, ensuring everything was secure, then replenished the fire, making it crackle cheerfully. He passed Ilara a cup of warm tea, their hands brushing lightly. She didn't pull away this time. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. He looked at her for a long moment, a depth of understanding in his eyes. "You still cry sometimes." "I hear you." Her breath caught, but she met his gaze, refusing to look away. "I don't want to make it worse by speaking on it," he added, his voice gentle. "But if you ever wanted to talk, I'd listen." She nodded once. "I know." And then, after a thoughtful pause, "You're not what I expected." "Is that good or bad?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his tone. She smiled, a real one this time, a genuine curve of her lips that reached her eyes. "I haven't decided yet." He chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "Fair enough." When she rose to check on the children, he stood too, a silent gesture of companionship, but didn't follow. She paused at the doorway, looking back at him. I remember a little more of her voice now. He didn't ask who. She didn't have to say. Outside, the wind howled its mournful song, but inside, the warmth held steady, a quiet, growing promise. The doctor arrived in the thick of a storm, his wagon wheels half buried in slush by the time Nolan and Caleb helped him onto the porch. He was a compact man with a weathered satchel and a persistent cough he dismissively waved off as just a bit of travel in the lungs. Ilara offered him hot tea and a dry towel, and by dusk he had carefully examined both children by firelight, his spectacles fogged at the edges from the warmth. "They're strong," he declared afterward, setting his cup down with care. "The girl's lungs are still healing, but the cough will pass. Boy's arm won't fully straighten, but he'll keep his strength." May nodded, satisfied. "That's enough." The doctor slept soundly in the loft that night and rode off the next morning, fortified with fresh bread in his coat and a blanket draped over his knees. Clara watched him go, her chin tucked into Ilara's side, her small fingers curled tightly in the wool of Ilara's skirt, a silent testament to her growing attachment. Later that day, while Caleb and Nolan worked together to fit a new gate to the west pasture, Ilara found herself alone in the workshed, sifting through a crate of old, rusty tools. Tucked away behind a cracked yoke, she discovered a small wooden box. Inside were letters, rough-edged and faded with time, addressed in a delicate, flowing woman's hand. She didn't read them. Instead, she carried the box to the porch and set it quietly beside Nolan's customary chair. He brushed sawdust from his sleeves and looked up, his eyes questioning. "Where'd you find it?" he asked. "Behind the yoke," Ilara replied. "I didn't open any." He ran his thumb gently along the edge of the lid. "My mother wrote those. She used to leave them for me to read aloud when I was too young to understand. Elara sat slowly beside him, her presence a comforting warmth. "Do you remember her?" she asked softly. "Bits," he replied, his gaze distant. "Her laugh, mostly." The way she held her coffee mug with both hands. She watched him for a moment, a shared understanding passing between them. "I remember my father's boots," Elara began, her voice tinged with a familiar sadness. The sound they made when he came up the stairs, and the smell of pipe tobacco. He didn't speak, simply listened, a quiet anchor. "She used to sing about the river," Elara added after a pause. "My mother. I thought it was just a song, but I found the place she meant. Just past the ridge. There's a bend where the water slows." "You go there often?" Nolan asked, a thoughtful note in his voice. "When I need quiet," she confirmed. "Next time," he said, meeting her gaze, "I'll ride with you." She didn't answer, but she didn't say no. The following week brought a welcome break in the relentless cold. The snow began to crust thin, and the sun, though still pale and weak, lingered longer in the sky. Elara took Clara out with her to gather kindling, while May began the arduous task of boiling soap in the yard. Caleb followed Nolan to check the far fence, his strides noticeably longer and more confident than they had been just weeks before. That evening, after supper, Elara found herself alone in the kitchen with Nolan. May had retired early with a headache, and the children had fallen asleep near the hearth, curled contentedly under the quilt Elara had lovingly patched from old shirts. "You ever think of leaving?" she asked, drying her hands on a worn cloth. "I did," Nolan admitted. "Years back. Thought maybe I'd head south, see the desert lands, but something always held me here." She leaned against the counter, a silent question in her eyes. "Obligation?" "No," he replied, his voice soft but firm. "Just didn't want to go without someone to come back to." He looked at her then, and there was no weight to his gaze, just truth, quiet and plain, a simple statement of his heart. Elara swallowed, her own dreams long buried. "I used to dream of cities, places where no one knew my name, where I could walk a market street and not carry anyone's burden but my own." "Still want that?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not anymore. I just want a place where the days are steady, and no one raises their voice." He stepped forward slowly, closing the small distance between them. "You have that here." She reached out without thinking, her fingers brushing the edge of his shirt sleeve. "I know." His hand found hers, warm and firm, and for a while they stood that way, their hands clasped, the only sound the faint shift of logs in the dying fire. If you're finding solace in this story of finding home, please consider sharing this video with a friend who might also appreciate a tale of true grit and tender hearts. The next morning, Elara rose early and saddled the mule herself, her movements practiced and sure. She packed a small satchel with bread and dried apples, then stepped into the bedroom where Nolan was just pulling on his boots. "I'm going to the river bend," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Thought maybe you'd come." He didn't smile, didn't nod, just picked up his coat and followed her out into the crisp morning light. The river bend lay quiet beneath the low winter sun, its surface edged with thin ice that hummed a faint, ethereal tune when the wind passed over it. Elara sat on a flat stone near the water, her boots planted firm in the cold soil, her skirts tucked neatly beneath her knees. Nolan stood a few paces behind, the mule's reins looped casually over a branch, watching the steady rise and fall of her shoulders with each breath. "You come here when you need quiet," he observed. She nodded, her eyes fixed on the gentle current. It's the only place that ever felt like mine. He stepped closer, but not too close, and sat beside her, glancing once at the slow-moving creek. My father used to say water remembers things long after people forget. Elara looked at him, her brows drawn in confusion. What does that mean? Not sure, he admitted, a slight shrug of his shoulders. But I always thought maybe it meant grief runs deep and joy floats on top, and both are true at once. She didn't answer right away. Then her voice soft. I used to believe sorrow was a thing you had to hold, that letting it go meant you didn't love what you lost. Nolan kept his gaze steady on the river, and now she turned her face to the pale sun, a thoughtful expression on her face. Now I think maybe sorrow just wants to be seen, not kept. A crow called from the pine trees behind them, its harsh cry echoing in the stillness. Nolan reached into his coat and pulled out a length of twine and a small carving knife. He began to strip the bark from a willow branch, the motion slow, careful, and deliberate. What are you making? She asked, watching his skilled hands. Fishing line holder. Caleb's been asking to learn. Elara watched the knife work its magic. He's grown more in the last few months than I thought possible. He watches everything, learns fast. She smiled faintly, a genuine, unforced curve of her lips. Like someone else I know. He didn't look up immediately. You mean me? Elara laughed, and the sound startled her. It came up from her chest, clear and unforced, a pure sound of joy. Nolan stopped carving and met her eyes, a warm light in his own. That's twice now, he said, his voice soft. What? You've smiled. Maybe you even meant it. Don't get ahead of yourself, she retorted, though the warmth in her face stayed, a flush of genuine happiness. They stayed there until the light shifted to a soft, golden hue, painting the landscape in gentle tones. On the way back, Clara, her small legs pumping, ran down the path to meet them, her braid bouncing against her back, cheeks pink with the cold. There's a letter, she announced breathlessly. From the post rider. May said it's for you. Elara frowned, a touch of apprehension entering her heart. For me? She took the envelope, the paper stiff, her name written in a hand she half recognized. She stepped inside while Nolan helped Clara feed the goats. May stood at the stove, stirring something that smelled of cider and cloves. It's from my brother, Elara said, her voice low, a tremor she couldn't quite control. May didn't turn. You don't owe him anything. Elara opened the letter with a steady hand. The words inside were short, the sentences pressed hard into the paper, conveying a desperate urgency. Obadiah was headed east, said he'd sold what little he had left. He wanted to know if she might return home, help him start over, rebuild a life from the ashes. She folded the letter carefully and set it on the mantel, her decision made. I'm not going back, she stated, her voice firm. May nodded, a silent affirmation. Didn't think you would. That night, Elara stood in the doorway while Nolan pulled off his boots. The children were already asleep, their soft breathing the only sound. The house had settled into that profound, comforting silence that only came when nothing needed tending, when the day's work was done and peace had descended. You ever think about what comes next? She asked, her voice quiet, almost a whisper. He straightened slowly, his gaze meeting hers. Like what? If Caleb and Clara stay, if they grow here. If they call this home? He stepped toward her, his presence warm and reassuring. I think about it every morning and every night. She reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. Then maybe we ought to make it a good place, not just for them, for us. Nolan held her gaze, his fingers closing around hers, a silent, powerful promise. You sure? She nodded, a certainty blooming in her heart. I don't cry when I wake anymore. That's how I know. He bent his head, and with a gentleness that spoke more than any vow, he kissed her forehead. Her breath caught, not from sorrow, but from something rising in its place. Something solid, steady, undeniably real. When they turned in for the night, she didn't take the quilt to the front room. She stayed, curling beside him beneath the worn wool blanket, his arm warm across her back, a silent testament to their burgeoning connection. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees, a lullaby from the wilderness. But inside, the house held quiet, a home truly beginning. March arrived with a sudden, welcome thaw. The ground softened underfoot, giving way to the promise of spring, and the first vibrant green shoots pressed tentatively through the old snow along the base of the cabin's north wall. Ilara stood barefoot on the porch one morning, her hem damp with meltwater, listening to the steady, rhythmic creak of a wagon axle approaching from the west trail. Nolan stepped out behind her, shrugging into his coat, his eyes already scanning the horizon. It's the Tanner boys, he explained. They help run the sawmill east of here. The wagon pulled up, two men perched on the seat, both covered in sawdust and wrapped in oilskin against the morning chill. The older one tipped his hat. We're building a new barn up by Alder Creek, he announced. Could use an extra team and a steady hand. Thought you might be interested, Nolan. Nolan glanced at Ilara, a silent question in his eyes. We've got mouths here, he reminded the men, a subtle reference to Clara and Caleb. You'd be home by sundown, the younger man added quickly, just for a week or two. Ilara didn't hesitate. Take the offer, she urged Nolan, her voice firm. He looked at her, uncertain, his brow furrowed. You've given more than your share to this place, she insisted. Let it give something back to you. After the Tanner boys left, their wagon rumbling into the distance, Ilara turned to Caleb and Clara, who had been watching the exchange from the window, their faces alight with curiosity. We'll keep things running here, she assured them. May can show you how to check the traps. May, ever practical, muttered something about boys and splinters. But Ilara was already gathering her coat, ready for the tasks ahead. The next several days passed without trouble, a comfortable rhythm settling over the homestead. Ilara taught Clara how to turn the rich, dark soil along the south field, showing her where the lingering frost still held its grip and where it had finally released its hold. At night, Caleb, his voice growing steadier and more confident with every passing page, read aloud by lamplight from a tattered book. May took charge of the smokehouse, her movements efficient and practiced, and Ilara cooked more than usual, filling the cabin with the comforting scent of pepper and rich meat stock. By the sixth day, the rhythm of their lives had settled into something close to ease, a quiet contentment. That afternoon, Ilara rode out to the ridge with Clara riding securely behind her. The girl had asked to see the wild plum trees blooming in the hollow, and Ilara remembered the way her own mother had once pointed them out, describing them as the first brave things to bloom after the long, harsh winter. They returned at dusk to find Nolan's horse tied patiently to the porch rail. Inside, he was seated at the table, a folded paper in his hand, his coat still damp from the ride. Ilara paused in the doorway, a hint of surprise in her voice. You're early. They finished ahead of schedule, he explained, rising to greet her. I wanted to get back before dark. He looked older somehow, a little wearier around the eyes, but his smile was quiet and sure, a beacon of reassurance. She stepped to him, her hands still dusty from the ride. "Did it help, being out there?" she asked, her voice soft. "It reminded me what I want to come home to," he replied, his gaze warm and steady. He held out the paper. "They offered me a share in the lumber partnership, said I could take on the West Quarter if I put up a stake in the spring." She took the page slowly, her fingers tracing the words. "Would that mean leaving the cattle behind?" "It would mean less riding out alone," he clarified, his eyes meeting hers. "More time here." He didn't add more than that. He didn't have to. She folded the paper and set it carefully on the mantel. "Then we'll find a way." That night, Nolan carried a pot of hot water into the bedroom. While Ilara laid out the new linens May had meticulously stitched. The children were already asleep, and the wind, having turned mild, gently lifted the curtains beside the window. He handed her a warm, damp cloth. "You've got soil on your cheek," he observed, his voice soft. She took it, but didn't use it right away, her gaze thoughtful. "You ever think about making something new here? Not just patching what was?" He moved closer, his presence a comforting warmth. "Every day," he confessed, his voice low. She reached up, cupping the side of his face, her fingers still rough from her day's work in the soil. "Then let's stop calling it survival. Let's build something worth passing down." He kissed her then, not tentative, not rushed, but steady and deep, like everything he had ever done. She leaned into it, her calloused fingers still rough from work, his breath warm against her skin, the room soft with lamplight and a profound, comforting quiet. For more stories of enduring love and unbreakable spirit from the American frontier, subscribe to True Wild West and join our community of history enthusiasts. By spring, they had cleared the north field, the rich soil ready for planting. Caleb and Nolan worked side by side, building a sturdy chicken run, while May patiently taught Clara how to dye wool using the natural colors of onion skins and lichen. Ilara planted squash and beans in long, careful rows, her fingers deep in the welcoming earth, feeling the promise of new life. One sunny Sunday morning, Nolan brought out a small cedar box. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried wildflowers, was a silver ring, beautifully carved with a delicate pine bough etched along the band. "I didn't ask before," he said, his voice a little softer than usual. "But I'm asking now, if you want to wear it." She took it with both hands, her heart full, and slipped it onto her finger without a word. Her eyes were bright, brimming with emotion, but no tears came. That summer, they built an addition to the cabin, 2 more rooms and a sturdy cellar. Caleb, with a newfound artistic flair, painted the new door a vibrant red, and Clara, ever practical, hung strings of dried orange peel from the rafters to keep the spiders out, she declared. May passed that winter, peacefully, her hands folded over a quilt pulled up to her chin. She went quietly, with Ilara reading aloud beside her, and Nolan standing vigil at the door, a silent guardian. They buried her beneath the ancient cottonwood tree just east of the garden, and Clara, with solemn care, planted lupine around the stone. Years passed, not fast, but full, each one adding another layer to the rich tapestry of their lives. Nolan embraced the lumber stake and worked half days, returning home with sawdust in his hair and new stories tucked into his coat pockets. Ilara, finding her true calling, started a small school for the neighbors' children, teaching them letters and songs in the cozy front room of their home. Caleb grew tall, steady-handed, and even-voiced, eventually taking over the cattle for himself, managing the herd with the quiet competence he had learned from Nolan. Clara, at 12, stitched her first dress and, brimming with pride, refused to wear anything else afterward. One evening, long after the first frost had settled over the land, Nolan sat beside Elara on the porch, two steaming mugs of chicory warming their hands. "You remember when I said I'd make you smile?" he asked, his voice soft with memory. She leaned her head on his shoulder, a profound sense of peace settling over her. "I remember everything." The stars blinked into existence over the ridge, countless diamonds scattered across the velvet sky, and the wind moved through the tall grass like it had nowhere else to be, a gentle, timeless whisper. They stayed like that, side by side, until the fire inside burned low, until the night folded in close and warm, full of everything they had built together. A life of quiet days and long, hard-earned love, a home that held forever. This story, like many others, reminds us of the incredible human spirit that shaped the American West. What part of Elara and Nolan's journey resonated most with you?